shouldn't there be a clap?
The clap has been done.
Oh, the clap has already happened. Keep all that in.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here with Naeem for a library chat. As in lieu of an introduction, perhaps we can attempt a joint introduction of both of us, because I think that we share, perhaps, where I feel like we share more, we have more in common in our trajectories as artists than pretty much any other artist that I know of, in the sense that we both arrived at similar moments in our lives. Our trajectories took us from the social sciences, the social sciences, and maybe moving to the United States at a very similar time in the early 90s from other countries, studying in the field of social science, having different odd jobs and thinking about the world. And then as we emerged out of our 20s into our 30s, we both, in parallel universes, sort of started asking very similar questions and choosing somehow to learn as autodidacts how to make films, videos, and exhibitions, and became artists pretty much at the same time, and then decided to, individually, we both chose to engage in research projects about very, very similar situations, which led to our encounter because we both made films about a very specific moment in history, a very odd and not particularly well-known moment in Middle Eastern history. And we finished our films the same year, in 2011. The film started circulating, and we both, I think, had the similar experience of having a number of different people saying, "Oh, you must absolutely meet Naeem. He's a wonderful artist, and he's working on exactly the same thing you are." And there's a little insect here. So that's my memory of our encounter, is that we've had both sort of had these very similar trajectories. And we met, I would say, in 2011 or 2012 in New York City. And do you remember exactly how this encounter occurred?
Yeah, I remember especially how I first started hearing about your work. So as you said, we'd been trained in the social sciences, and certainly for me, I was thinking of ways to tell the particular histories of the revolutionary left of the 1970s that I had started researching, and a certain kind of linear documentary didn't seem to provide answers when I saw it made by others or when I was trying it myself. And so, as you referenced, 2011, we both completed, I think still to this date, maybe there are other English language films on the Japanese Red Army, but I haven't really encountered them so much. But we both made films about the Japanese Red Army in the 1970s, approaching it from a very different way. And mine, United Red Army, which was specifically about a hijacking that the Japanese Red Army carried out that landed the plane in Bangladesh through a series of serendipity accident. And yours was about two members of the Japanese Red Army who were in some sort of physical and mental exile, one, Mei Shigenobu, who was at that time in Beirut, with her mother already in prison, I think, Fusaku Shigenobu, and then Masao Adachi, who was in Japan, but in some sort of exile because he couldn't leave. They had taken his passport away. And mine is a film where you never see the hijackers. You're actually in darkness most of the time. And yours is a film where you never see the protagonists, but you hear their voices continuously, and then you film in Lebanon in their proxy. And I think our connective tissue was Miriam Arsenio's and this space called 98 Weeks in Lebanon.
Yes.
And she programmed my film, and the first thing she said is, "Have you seen Eric's film, Anabasis of May and Fusaku Shigenobu?" And I hadn't seen it, and that's how it came about. And I remember, just to say that, because we also talked about strategies of storytelling, that when I first saw the film, first of all, I was just astonished and also relieved that I had astonished at the film itself, but also relieved that I saw it after I'd finished my film, because I felt, okay, if I had seen this, I would get stuck, because I would want somehow to borrow from your storytelling path and then also not be able to borrow because it's your distinct voice. So sometimes not knowing is useful. That was the first encounter, yeah.
And what I think one of the reasons why I feel close to you and to your practice, even though in many ways you've moved on to cover, to be interested artistically in political situations that have a lot to do with the Indian subcontinent, and we aren't necessarily overlapping so much in the areas in which we are working on today. But what I feel, one proximity that I feel is that I feel that we, in our own ways, have always approached making work or making films as a formal question. We are comfortable as researchers entering sort of the labyrinth of history, finding situations that we are interested in. But the problem as filmmakers is to find a form that accommodates the messy stories that we're interested in.
And satisfies you,
right?
In terms of the bug of what you're trying to.
And that is also a solution that is not, strictly speaking, the solution that we may have been trained to implement as social scientists. In other words, we've both arrived at this point where we want to tell these stories, and we've both decided that we aren't going to write sort of traditional books expanding on this research, that we want to find forms. And in both cases, because we were dealing early on with a similar problem, the question of left-wing terrorism in the 1970s, the question of images is central to the
images produced by both sides.
Right.
The state and the insurrectionaries. But go on.
And so essentially, you could simplify this question of terrorism as a question of image making, right? A small group armed that has chosen armed struggle chooses to stage spectacular events. Hijacking airplanes was the medium of choice for the Japanese Red Army, which maybe just to build a little bit of context was a small Marxist-Leninist group that emerged from the student movement and the workers' movement in Tokyo in the late 1960s.
In the context also of worldwide protest against the Vietnam War.
Precisely.
Which had also radicalized everyone.
And in 68, 69, they went underground, and through a series of spectacular terrorist actions, mostly airplane hijackings, attempted to draw attention to the Palestinian cause and to sort of, I guess, expose their viewpoint through these events by seizing media attention. And therefore the question of images, or rather the propagation of images and of speech, is central to the project of the Japanese Red Army. So as filmmakers, finding formal solutions to tell this story in a medium that is image-based is in and of itself a problem. What images do you show when telling these stories? And in some way, what's interesting about both of our films is that we choose very different solutions to this problem of images.
And just to say that in your film, Masao Adachi is the official or unofficial filmmaker of the movement. That's why in some ways he's in this legal limbo, because he has never taken part in any actions, but he's made films. So he can get prosecuted but not fully. And then in mine, the film footage is actually from Carol Wells, who is one of the hostages on the plane, and she was in a very traditional Hollywood film with Barbra Streisand. So they are very different media artifacts that show up. Just to also say that what I was also struck by the Japanese Red Army in particular, their high period is quite small. It's less than a decade. But speaking of images, I read in a few places that one of the things that made them temporarily successful is this small period where Japanese passengers are not the suspect passengers. Therefore, they can move easily in the world. That's also another thing that I think we were thinking through as, of course, also all this work is made in a post 9/11 context of um, hyper racialization of a different population, right? Which, of course, we're still in that cycle in a way. So I think I know that for me, I was also trying to think of strategies to talk about now by talking about then and bringing people into, a space of misrecognition. You see the Japanese protagonists and you wonder why they're in Bangladesh or in Lebanon. And I think, as your film quite gently touches on, is that after the main event, after you're now guests of the state, I think some of your protagonists also, they lose something to do. Like they become, and I think that I always saw as something that you and I were interested in, is the drifting, floating elements. And just to say one other thing about the whole juxtaposition between research practices and the films that end up out of them, is that I feel like I've battled a tendency to try to chase down the facts, that because we live in a time where more facts aren't necessarily what's needed. People are responding to almost everything in an emotional vein. So sometimes more information sharing is less what's needed, but then we also get tripped up by it. I remember that when we were in Japan together, right before the pandemic, the show we had together, like literally before for the first cases get discovered, so January, February, Masao Adachi was there as invited by you as your guest, and of course he was in that film, and then you wrote a script together for the film The Ugly One, with Rabie that we were discussing earlier, Rabie Marue. And Masao Adachi comes to me and sort of starts arguing with me because he has seen non-facts or incorrect facts in my film. And I'm trying to sort of get him into this, and also, of course, through translation. He's speaking in Japanese, somebody's translating that, it wasn't trying to be a documentary film. But of course, he sees the shell of the documentary as well. So I feel like that was also there, where I remember thinking you have a very different relationship with him because you've also made a film together. And then also, I guess, AKA Jihadi is also homage to the... Yeah, so that's something to think about also, that your immersion with the protagonist is also in a different way, but also counterintuitive, because one wouldn't expect you to necessarily have that partnership with Masao Adachi, but you did get there.
So you've mentioned a few things that I think are interesting. One is this sort of the idea of abstraction versus specificity, and the second is distance versus proximity to the subjects of the film. And it's true that so I wanted to talk about two things. One is to go back to this question of images. What struck me when I finally discovered your film, is that you had solved the problem of images in a very radical way by essentially, for a large part of the film, there are no images.
Right. You're in darkness.
You're in darkness. There's the voice, which is the recordings of the hostage taker, or the lead hostage taker in the airport, in the airplane in Dhaka, dialoguing with an officer from the Bangladeshi army who's in the control tower, and negotiating the situation in the hostage crisis.
Through English, which is a second language for both
of them.
Right.
And so it's essentially a very simple dialogue, or it's a very complex dialogue, but said with very simple words. And you resolve the problem of what to show as a filmmaker by having a black screen and just words on screen. So it's essentially a film that is driven, for the most part, by subtitles and voice. It's essentially a radio play that is turned into a film, and then we project our own mental images onto these black screens, and then it becomes a film populated with all kinds of images that are, for the most part, the projections inside of our own minds. And in my own parallel world, when I was thinking about similar problems for the film The Anabasis, because there was this idea of there were no images of any of these protagonists throughout all their years where they were clandestine underground. They recorded no images. They destroyed the photographs that they had with them. So there's a whole period without images. And in fact, the full title of my film is The Anabasis of Mein Fusako Shigenobu, Masao Adachi in 27 Years without images.
That's right.
And the way that this got solved for me, but this was one of the longest things longest problems that I solved in the filmmaking, it took several years, was my encounter with Masao Adachi, when he essentially said, I will tell you my story, but in exchange, I want you to make images for me when you go to Beirut,
because he can't also.
I can no longer travel.
Right.
So my images in the film are replacement images that are commissioned by the subject of the film, Masao Adachi, who is a self-avowed terrorist. And this segs back to the second point I wanted to that you raised, which is this idea of the relationship with the subject. What was seminal for me in the Anabasis was this idea that I am engaged in a transaction with the subject of the film, who is a former terrorist, and that this film is the expression of our transaction.
Right.
I make images for him, in exchange of which he tells his story or his version of the story.
He recognizes you as someone who can travel in the ways he cannot.
Right.
In a way that in the 70s he could. The 70s was also that period of high internationalism, people being taken to Jordan as guests of the Jordanian state. There's the Bangladeshi painter who started the contemporary art school after Bangladesh became independent, Zainul Abidin, was actually taken to Jordan in 1970 to sketch the refugee camps, and that was very typical. It's like almost so Masao is responding to you as an artist in the contemporary who has the travel freedom in some ways that he himself didn't have. And as you mentioned, the relationship with the protagonist, I'm also realizing there's a triangle, at least with the plane hijack of 77 that my film was about. My main entry point was the negotiator, who is still alive, A.G. Mahmood, and then eventually I found Carol Wells in Los Angeles. I never found the protagonists of the hijack, and Dankesu, codename Dankesu, probably passed away in jail soon after the film was finished. And you were at this part of the triangle, right? But also at a remove, because it's worth mentioning that Masao Adachi officially never took part in an action. That's why he's in the liminal space. He made films, which was still considered material support, but not actually engaging in an actual hijack. And then May is Fusaku's daughter. So technically she had never committed an action either, but she in some ways becomes orphaned in Lebanon when her mother finally is caught and imprisoned. So you find this part of the triangle, but you also found people with like a degree of remove. And the thing about Anabasis film, which I also wrote about, is that you also found the films they made. And what was extraordinary about the films that Masao Adachi made in that time is, they're made in the heat of the moment, 69, 77, all the way mid-70s, and you expect them to be films that, I've heard this phrase before, are useful to the movement, but they're quite extraordinarily, they're strange. I wouldn't say that I've written about that scene. I wouldn't say that some of those things would be considered useful to the movement. So I also feel that your work I saw as, you're very close to people who participated in the movement, but sometimes for the survivors or alumni or memoirists of that time, there is usually a compulsion that anything I do or any time I give to you, Eric, must result in something that's useful for the movement today. And when you see Anabasis, it's not necessarily. So he has a line in there where he says, what does he say? He says, well, I'm a drinker, so I'm glad that I couldn't be in Japan because I would have drunk myself to death, something like that.
If I hadn't he said, if I hadn't spent 27 years in Beirut, I would probably be dead from alcoholism.
That's right.
But because of my years as a militant, when I didn't drink, I'm still around today. And in fact, he is an 84-year-old in very good health, and I think we've both been drinking with him in Tokyo, and we can assert to the fact that he's very much alive and strong in spirit. So one of the things that you bring up, which I find to be very interesting, is the relationship between usefulness and art, which traditionally has been associated
usefulness as desired by people in the movement,
right? Political usefulness versus non-useful art making. And Masao Adachi always combined both. He's somebody who comes from surrealism, he comes from experimental film, and his approach as a revolutionary propagandist borrows very much from this avant-garde tradition. And I wanted to make a connection to what we do as people who make work. We've come from sort of a research-based social scientific background. How do you think about this question of usefulness in making the work. In other words, if you were, if you had continued in sort of a straight line as a researcher or academic,
Television documentary.
either television documentary that seeks some form of objectivity, some kinds of bringing information to the viewer. You chose to be somebody who makes films and who shows them primarily in a very different world,
Right.
distribution circuit and
Right.
funding
Or that
circuit.
world chose me, I think, just as it chose you. I don't even know if we pointed to them or they invited us in, kind of thing.
But why did you or why did we end up in this place where it isn't so much about information, it isn't so much about accuracy or usefulness, it's about something else? Why did this encounter take place, and what do we find in this space?
I mean, I think, I've worked on primarily the 1970s moment of both uprisings that are left insurrectionary, including, violent means of overthrow, and also decolonization, which is also a very violent process. And in almost every single one of these countries that become independent in the 70s, it's either preceded by spectacular acts of violence that are accepted somehow in the cost of liberation, or extreme violence after liberation, when it turns onto itself. And I've, of course, encountered the second one much more, because in Bangladesh we have both extreme violence at the time of liberation and then afterwards, when the movement leaders cannibalize each other. And within 4 years, none of the liberation leadership is around anymore. So I always saw these events as the neat morals and therefore sentences that we had grown up hearing just weren't true, because none of it had worked out like that. There's a line maybe from Hannah Arendt about independence movements that don't liberate their own leadership, and that's what I had encountered. So I became very wary of the kind of documentary films that I was raised around, where there would always be an ending which would wrap things up, bring you to the now, and say, therefore, we need to keep fighting to preserve that ideal. And I was like, maybe that ideal wasn't in the first place something that the leadership even believed in. And I think the kind of ambiguity that I felt spoke more to our generation's experience. We also came of age when the Berlin Wall had collapsed and a certain set of stories had suddenly been put into crisis. That wasn't welcome in television documentary world, and the contemporary art context of a museum and gallery really emerged as a place that had high tolerance for ambiguity, for films that didn't finish, that films that were like 20 minutes long, and somebody might have thought, no, you should make it an hour so that you can answer everything. I made a film about Bangladeshis in Lebanon that's only 6 minutes long, that doesn't answer anything, doesn't finish. It's like literally the first sketch. And I think, as you did also, the contemporary museum is a space that allowed that. I remember your solo show at Tabacalera and the kind of early works that you're showing, Sugar Water that we talked about earlier, and the one about the Japanese magazine Scratcher, the censorship. Those pieces don't finish, which is why it's ideal also that the loop, because you come back to the beginning and you go, okay, did I understand? Maybe I didn't understand. I'll watch it again. Okay, there's less understanding. There is more staying with the feeling of trying to figure things out. I mean, I was mentioning this morning about reading Annie Ernaux's The Years in translation. It's France from 1940 to 2006, and she uses a tone that's familiar also from Chris Marker, where she speaks of these rallies and the Arab presence within it, or the Arab presence in the city, in a language where she doesn't feel like, oh, by the way, I'm being sarcastic. I want to explain to you that my sentiments are obviously for more immigrants in France. She ventriloquizes certain kinds of noxious views with the confidence that you understand what the project is. And I found that maybe another way to say it is that television documentary wanted things to be clear, but where do you really stand? And I think this was a space that I believe for both of us was a space where we didn't constantly have to reassure and underline what we stood for.
So in defense of ambiguity, what's the importance of ambiguity, abstraction, non-understanding in the work?
I think I come back to a sentence that I read in a op-ed that I believe Hari Kunzru wrote after the Charlie Hebdo attacks, and I am quoting from memory. I hope I don't misattribute. And he was living in Paris at the time, but had written it in English. And I remember the sentence was something along the lines of, if we are going to learn how to live together in this world, we have to develop the ability to hold more than one idea in our heads at the same time. And those two ideas or concepts are in conflict. I find ambiguity and non-certainty and the idea of the non-ending to be a space within which I can hold at the best, as opposed to certainly in both an educational context in terms of teaching and an American context of circulation of images, which I'm most familiar with. There is a push for clarity, and the clarity, if it doesn't come in the work, does come sometimes in the Q&A afterwards, where and so that's something that I've been navigating. I had a question for you, which is that for a period, your works are actually geographically and periodically located. Anabasis is located in the intersection of Lebanon and Japan. And the earlier film I mentioned is also set in Japan. And then you make The Ugly One, which is set in Lebanon with Rabia Maroue, but then co-scripted with Masao. And then you make AKA Jihadi, homage in some ways to AKA Serial Killer. And so I remember looking at that body of work and feeling, thinking, hoping that this is a space that you're going to continue to stay in for my own interest, right? And then you go somewhere quite radically different, all the way up to the current project, which I know you had said this morning that the current show in Berlin maybe is not so explicitly political, but in a way it is also, because you're asking people to project images and the machine draws abstract squiggly figures that may or may not be related to Rabia Maroue being in the room or not. There was a time when you were not only located in a geography, you were starting to develop a certain kind of, I don't want to say expertise, but certain kind of familiarity. That's what I saw with Masao Adachi when I met him, is that he had an ease with you because he trusted you in a way that gets built up over time. But you've also chosen to shift away from what was familiar and known.
Well, I think my movement is starting from questions that are distant in terms of time or distant in terms of geography. Those that happen to be the questions that I grew up being interested in. When I was an adolescent in France, I was, interested in. I watched the images of the war and civil war in Lebanon, conflicts between Israel and Palestine, the falling of the Berlin Wall. These were events that happened far away, but that I was intimately interested in. And so I think when I became an artist, I naturally started working on these questions, or the lesser known details, or the small stories that you find in the folds of history. And I have gradually been moving closer to the here and the now. And I think even a film like, also known as Jihadi, was important because it was a way of bringing some of these questions, but dealing with them through their effects in France at a particular moment, to then working with children in a middle school in the suburbs of Paris for 4 years, collaborating with them. So up until the current project that I'm working on, it's the first time I work on a very sort of family story, intimate story that's about my mom, myself, and this
machine
research in parapsychology and sort of the study of paranormal phenomena. So it's sometimes you start with yourself, and then you gradually, over the course of your career, start becoming interested in the world. Perhaps I'm taking the opposite route for now, but both concerns will always be part of the practice. The other project I'm working on now is related to Guantanamo and the history of the detention and the very strange and almost absurd and almost surreal things that occur when so-called great democracies find themselves mixed up in some of the most horrendous, non-democratic, non-transparent,
Right.
illiberal behaviors, and the absurdity that can emerge from this kind of situation. But I'm trying to treat it in a manner closer to comedy than tragedy. But I think that it's always been about, again, this question that we started with, which is to find forms to think about political histories that are important in our lives or in our political consciousness, and trying to find forms that allow us to think about them, as you said very beautifully, in terms of ambiguities, in terms of abstraction, for a very simple reason that these forms...
And non-resolution also.
Non-resolution.
Not to get to an end.
Because non-resolution and abstraction means that the form gives space for viewers to do some of the work, to think, to find a place for themselves, to situate themselves inside of a story or continue to think about the story, which is really the opposite of what a lot of conventional filmmaking is about, which is to take you on a roller coaster ride on a very specific trajectory from which you may have been very well entertained. You didn't have to work too hard. You had a good hour and a half, but at the end, it's unclear whether things will stay with you if you didn't have to put a little bit more of yourself into the story. So I think these questions of ambiguity, non-resolution, are also a very generous way of giving space for viewers to inhabit the film, to develop their own relationship with these stories.
Yeah, I think, when you're describing your current project and also the future project and the parapsychology project, and then when I thought of the films of yours that in my mind had located you in a geography, which interestingly is not France or the United States, the two places with which we have a familiar link, but Japan and Lebanon. Earlier today when we were having coffee, we were talking about all the various diasporas we know, including the significant, Arab diaspora in France and Germany, the significant South Asian diaspora in England, and then a very different kind of diaspora experience that I have in the United States, and talking about how Berlin was shifting, maybe now it's shifting a different direction as a home for a community of artists that were coming there to find a voice, or in Paris, etc. You made this short film during the pandemic, which is very much, there's no humans. Your camera is moving all across the city or near your home, but you also have the clear sense of not being able to go anywhere. It was a beautiful film. And I had a different but similar experience of physical travel became dramatically curtailed for me from the pandemic onwards, both because of the travel lockdowns, US Bangladesh travel, but also because of changes in my family situation, the passing of my father, which when my mother now lives with me, so I travel much less. And both because of that and also because the pandemic caused me to just want to be local in some ways, whatever local might mean. I made 2 films that were set in the US, short films. One about a artist who lives in the Fluxus building. It's 20 minutes, you never see her, just her voice. And then another short documentary about the third person to sign up for Maine's right to dignified death, which is euthanasia. And just following her life in preparation for death. But they're both protagonists are American, for lack of a better word. Put that within quotes. And the project I'm working on right now is, in a way, looking at student protest on American campuses during the Vietnam War. I was working on it anyway. Analog to current moments come up. I have seen this interesting confounding of, this phrase of what you're supposed to be making work about, or what you've developed as an expertise, both of things that we can question. There is a way that people do feel comforted by geographic specialization that is located to where you're presumed to have a right to speak of, right? I had this experience in screening this film of Sun's Long Day, which is the middle section about the German autumn. I always get questioned about the German autumn because it's presumed that I might have made a mistake with the footnotes in that section. but I don't get questioned about the Bangladesh section because it's presumed that I'm a authentic
And that's-
interlocutor
right.
for that, even though I could be just as unreliable for that. And that's why I come back to, that body of work that you made and that you moved. I think those are specific decisions you made. And then with the children, you arrive in a situation which is both French, but also the France that, is really everyone from all over the world has arrived here and has to make family and community or get along. And then I thought that film is extraordinary in terms of what it tries to do. The analog I think of is my friend Sam Green, who made the film on the Weather Underground, and who made a film about Esperanto, the universal language that failed in a way because there wasn't enough financial interest in figuring out a way that people could speak a language that's not any of the languages that they belong to.
I guess one of the things that you raise here is the idea, which I think is a little bit, well, for very good reason, has been sort of challenged, which is that you can tell other people's stories, right? And so the safe space today, given the current intellectual environment, is that the closer you remain to your own biographical experience, the safer that space is, because it's necessarily legitimate because it's your personal experience. Right. And the further away you stray from the strictly biographically experienced, the more at risk you are of being wrong, of speaking outside of your sort of area of expertise. But at the same time, this is obviously...
Which is an idea I think you and I both would like to challenge.
Of course. Yeah. And I think in general, in the course of art and literary history has been the possibility that one may be able to, without necessarily entering into the universalist sort of claims, but that it's possible to venture outside of your strict biographical experience and to very carefully, with a very strict ethic and with a very high level of, I would say, political exigency, or the bar is very high not to make any mistakes. But that I think it's important that younger artists today feel that it is absolutely still possible to venture outside of the zone of the strictly autobiographical, because that's what great films and great books and great artworks have always been made of, as well as the incredibly rich and important personal narratives.
Right. And I think it's also okay if there are errors. Right. I think dislocation and defamiliarization is a very helpful state to be in.
Right.
And yes, there are some incredibly internal lived experience and knowledges that you may not know arriving in a different situation.
Right.
But you may also see certain things that other people don't,
right.
because you're less familiar. So I feel politically also it's something I want to push against, because the idea that you can only make work about that which you belong to and that nobody else can pushes against the other thing that we face in a world today, which is that we are being asked to be in solidarity with peoples of other parts of the world. But then, it's a complicated...
Right. Right.
I don't... Again, I realize in my head I'm trying to get it to somewhere where it can be like resolved, but it's not resolved. Right. It's.
But one thing that comes to mind is that, because I recently made a film about the Italian Red Brigades.
Oh, okay.
While living in Italy, at a time when Italy was celebrating, or not celebrating, or perhaps mourning the 40th anniversary of the death of Aldo Moro.
Right.
And this is the film attempted to talk about this situation. Right. And what I found was that even though Italian culture and history is much closer to me than Japanese culture and history is, because it's a neighboring country, and that Italy and France have very similar experiences with left-wing movements and the history of terrorism in the 1970s. In Italy, I found there was a great deal of resistance to the idea that I, as a French person, would go and look into this history. Italians feel that everybody has a very intimate relationship to this story, and there's a great deal of suspicion on anybody coming from the outside and looking inside. Whereas in Japan, even though in many, many ways, the Japanese culture and history is much further than from me in terms of my own experience, linguistic abilities, etc. The history of the radical left in Japan has been so deeply buried
Submerged,
under the ground.
Hardly any work made about it, right?
That literally all of the response that I've received after showing the film in Japan has been the opposite as what I was talking about in Italy, which is people being extremely happy that people from the outside are sort of digging into this history, because either the history is not available to them, or they don't necessarily feel authorized to unearth it. And I think to some extent, probably our two films, having circulated back to Japan extensively, having been shown back in Japan, it's a very specific thing. It's I think in some way has also empowered younger generations of artists and filmmakers to seize this history and turn it into reclaim it in a sense. But it's possible that there was a need for two outsiders to open a little window to allow certain things to occur within Japan that might have been more time, would have been taken more time, would have been more difficult to occur if we hadn't done this.
Right. And sometimes also you access certain other archives because you're not going through the national narrative.
Right.
So with the Hijack film and with Afsan's Long Day, the next film, the archives I access become a way of talking about Asia through a European context, where the archives are very much focused on what Europe's going through. But in the backdrop is, of course, Vietnam, and how that has also generated the fear that was very active at the time. Vietnam was central to the domino theory, that if you let Vietnam fall, one after another Asian country will go that way.
Right.
In the end, of course, that's not how it plays out. Vietnam, quote unquote, falls, but it doesn't spread in the way they're fearful. And of course, there are geopolitical reasons for that. But I felt, who used that phrase, the silly archives? Maybe Ballon, I can't remember. But these are also archives not of the main event. And I think for the nation state and the national television from which some of these archives emerge, if you are off that geography, some of this may seem trivial because you are embedded in the main event and you're looking for the footage of the main event. I don't have the same attachment to the main event. You don't in these ways. So then we look at fragments, I think, yeah.
So perhaps talking about fragments would be a good way to not conclude this talk.
Yes. We can just drift away into
a sea of fragments.
Yeah.